What are the most meta decks in the One Piece TCG? Let's talk about it. What's up, captains? Welcome back to the other decks. My name is Casual Dobo, and today we're going to be doing a tier list of the first set of the One Piece TCG OP01 Romance Dawn. Now, normally I don't do tier lists, but to sort of make it more fun, I decided to create my own tiers. So we have meta in all caps, less meta in all lowercase, kind of meh, and if you win with this deck, you are God tier. That's right, the deck is not God tier, you, the pilot, are God tier. So those are the tiers that we're going to be working with. Interpret them as you will. And also, just in case, these rankings are just my opinion. But if you agree or disagree, please let me know in the comments down below. Would love to hear from you. Alright, let's go ahead and start off strong with Zorro. So for me, Zorro is meta. He is the perfect embodiment of aggro, with his leader ability giving a boost to all of your cards for only 1 Dawn. Great to catch your opponents off guard with some slightly more powerful attackers, potentially baiting out some blockers if your opponent doesn't have the counters to really handle that, and has some great synergy with low-cost vanillas that have huge power. And obviously don't forget about the key rush cards like Zorro, Luffy, and Shanks. Now, I do think that the weakness of Zorro is that it can be pretty linear, right? Other than the burst that kind of comes from rush naturally, you can kind of predict where this deck is going to go, right? It doesn't necessarily have that Dawn flexibility that starter Luffy has, so it might be worthwhile to splash in some starter Nami into the deck to provide some of that versatility. Next up is Red Green Law, and I gotta say, this deck is meta. However, I'm going to put it right underneath Zorro, mostly because it is a 2-color leader, and starting off with 4 life does seem pretty detrimental, especially in a best of 1 format. Now, of all the dual color leaders, I do think that Law is the best, and his kit synergizes very well with Character Law from OP01, and is probably the premier leader when it comes to red-green supernova synergies. I mean, just take a look at what it gets. Access to Red's Rush, Green's Search ability, a number of blockers, and a decent amount of counters. Plus, there are some real shenanigans that you can use with the Shambles ability that synergize well with Otama and some of the red removal cards like Jet Pistol. And really, honestly, the weakness here is the 4 life. I think you do need to have a pretty solid hand of blockers out of the gates in your starting hand in order to stay healthy enough to get into your sort of wombo combos and find a cost kid. Next up, going to the other red-green leader, we have red-green Luffy. So, honestly, I'm a personal huge fan of this card, especially since it was kind of the first dual-color leader that was revealed. Not to mention, there are a ton of 5 costs or lower supernovas that would love to attack again. Looking at you, Basil Hawkins. And honestly, you can probably build this in the same way you would build Red-Green Law. So why do I put it in the less meta category? Well, 4 Dawn to untap a destroyable target is a little expensive, to be honest. I mean, if we just take a look at a similar counterpart in Starter Leader Kid, that costs 3 Dawn and a discard, but you get to activate your leader who cannot be KO'd and can, attack twice for big hits. With Red-Green Luffy, the biggest surprise you can give is probably a 5 cost Rush Luffy, but even then, it's still 5 costs to play, 4 to reactivate, so that is 9 Dawn total for 2 hits at 6k, compared to, Leader Kid. Honestly, it doesn't feel worth it. Next up is Oden, and man, I love Oden. You don't know how much I love Oden. As a character in the series, he is awesome. And his effect in the game is pretty interesting too, because it allows you to discard a Wano card to reactivate 2 Dawn. However, the current support for this is rough. So it is with a heavy heart that I actually have to put Oden all the way down into the meh category. Yeah, in OP01, the Wano support is a bit lacking, and it's really hurt by the fact that many of those key abilities for the sort of Wano country Red Scabbards archetype are when attacking abilities. So at minimum, you need 2 turns to essentially get these effects off, right? Because green does not have access to rush. Now normally this wouldn't be too problematic, however, when facing some of the more meta decks, you'll notice that there's a lot of single target removal, lots of opportunities to control your board, and so it kind of gets very difficult to overcome. Next up we have Doflamingo, and Dofi has a very interesting ability, not gonna lie. It costs 3 total, and you do have to attack, but when you do, you reveal the top card of the deck, and if it is a 4 cost or lower Warlord, you can cheat it out. But it does come in rested. But the real question is it worth it? Based on a quick search on OnePieceCardGame.dev, it looks like you can play a lot of tap blockers, really. The most value you can probably get out of cheating out a Warlord is something with an on-play ability. With the best ones probably being Gecko Moria, Marshall D. Teach, aka Blackbeard. Character Dofi has some utility here because you get to scry the top 5 of your deck, see if you want to keep it or bottom deck all of it. But you really do need to ensure that when you're using this ability that you have the blockers available on board to protect whatever you put out, because otherwise it's super vulnerable. Moving on to our next leader, or really I should say leaders, I'm going to cover both Blurple or Blue Purple Kaido and Blurple Crocodile. So Blurple across the board is very interesting. It has access to some of the most useful event cards in the game and has multiple ways of controlling your opponent's board. Want to KO something? Purple's got you covered. You want to return something to their hand or their deck? Blue's got you covered. Plus, think about it. What is more menacing than having the ability to draw cards and ramp? Speed. Speed is honestly kind of the killer for both of these decks, right? Both Blurple Crocodile and Blurple Kaido need time to set up. Kaido needs setup in order to ramp and keep up with some of those Dawn minus abilities that, power all of its very strong removal effects. And Crocodile needs to keep a sort of balanced hand in order to utilize his own ability, synergizing with things such as Level of Mellow. So these decks, while they're both interesting and cool, do have a bit of a higher skill ceiling. And just generally harder to operate and harder to get right. Not saying that they can't win events, it's just more difficult. So I would actually count both of these as less meta, with Blurple Crocodile taking the edge over Blurple Kaido, just by a little bit, just because I do think that his ability has more opportunity to be consistently triggered. Alright, next up is the King deck, and while he can do well in tourneys, it ain't because of the deck. If this thing wins, it's because the pilot is god tier. Shout out again to Craig is King for getting second in one of the first, fan Discord tourneys with the King deck. But make no mistake, if he had won that thing, he would have to change his name to Craig is God. I think the problem, honestly, with King right now is that he kind of flies in the face of what Purple wants to do. First of all, for the effect, you need 10 Dawn out on the field in order to give your opponent's characters minus 1k power. So under most normal circumstances, you're getting this ability at like turn 5, turn 6, right? And you need ways to balance the Dawn minus abilities of Purple with ramp. Now, it's kind of easy with Dawn minus 1 abilities, especially if you have Onigashima out, but the difficulty really comes in Dawn minus really anything else above 1, right? So think about Brachio Bomber, Dawn minus 6. If you use that ability in this matchup, it becomes a lot more of an uphill battle to get back to having your King be a viable leader ability again. And that variability and almost counter identity to what Purple wants to do in set 1 is what hurts this deck the most in a meta that is, thriving on consistency and synergy. Alright, next up, moving on to Uta from Film Red, and yes, I am including her just because it does seem like we're going to be getting her starter deck cards in the form of store tournament participation prizes. So that's pretty cool, and that's why I'm including this in the set 1 stuff and not necessarily the Shanks leader, just because that's coming like later winter 2023, aka like a couple months from now. But I gotta say that Uta is once again, if you win, you're god tier. This deck is really designed to be a leader for vanillas, but to be honest, vanillas are not that good right now. And I think to balance the deck out, you still need to play a handful of, rush cards or some cards with abilities, so that when you do make your move, you can do some real burst damage with Uta. But honestly, probably not worth it if you're trying to compete in, a tournament, right? But I do encourage you to try and bring this to locals and kick someone's butt with it, because I think it can be a ton of fun. So that is all for the set 1 leaders, including Uta. Now let's get into the starter leaders. However, before we do that, I do want to just take a moment to thank the members of this channel, the commanders of the other decks Grand Fleet. That is Ouijibug, Jack, David, Solomon, Austin, Atlas, Q, and John. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. Really appreciate it and hope you're enjoying the emotes. And for those of you who can't join the membership, if you want to support the channel in some other free ways, hitting the like button and subscribe to the channel are always appreciated. It helps me know what y'all want to see from this channel and allows our community to grow as we continue covering the One Piece TCG. Alright, now let's get into the starter leaders, starting with Red Luffy. So Luffy was arguably the worst starter deck of the 4, not gonna lie, even throughout the starter deck and the deck limited formats. However, OP01 gives the deck a huge boost, allowing it to become, honestly, a contender in the meta. And that's why I'm putting this in the meta category. While most builds will not run, a ton of counters still, it does get a ton of defense in the form of more blockers, and gets some offensive firepower in the forms of Rush Zorro and Shanks. But to be honest, the big question was never, is it meta? Rather, the question is, Zorro or Luffy? And to be honest, they have very similar builds. So it really depends on what you value, right? However, and this wouldn't be a tier list without actually making a decision, I'm gonna put Luffy slightly ahead, which honestly kind of goes against my own instincts. But I think the thing is, the built-in Dawn flexibility that Luffy gives you, and this deck gives you, is a bit more versatile. And it allows you to swap out the starter Nami, which isn't grabbable by Search Nami. And keep in mind that some of the key red character cards happen to have Dawn ×1 abilities, so that means you do need to attach 1 Dawn, but Luffy Leader's ability to have you have that Dawn flexibility is pretty key in being able to play cards and then activate those abilities. With that all said, I gotta say, when it comes to mono red, leaders, Luffy and Zorro are 1A, 1B in my eyes. Moving on over to Green Kid. Not even going to delay this. This one is 100% meta. I will put it just above the Luffy deck. And while it's honestly not too different from the base starter deck, it does get some additional supernova blockers such as Killer. But most importantly, the most important card in here, 8-cost Kid, right? This is one of the strongest cards that's being released for this deck, and really one of the strongest cards to be released in set 1. Untargetable by most things because of its 8 cost, it's incredibly sticky, being able to stay on the board longer than you, as the opponent, want. But what makes it so good? If it is rested, your opponent cannot attack anything other than characters named Eustace, Captain Kid, and yes, that does include protecting your leader Kid. However, I would say that the biggest weakness is that this deck is pretty reliant and is carried by 8-cost Kid, right? So if you do find ways to deal with it, say, an Otama Jet Pistol combo, Round Table Nico Robin, you can deal a huge blow to the deck. All right, next up is Blue Crocodile. So this one is, honestly, it was a true Cinderella story in the deck limited battles, getting some very solid wins. Unfortunately, the clock has struck midnight on this deck in OP01, and it's come crashing back down to earth. So much so that I'm placing it in the meh category, and to add insult to injury, it comes after Oden. Unfortunately, as a 7 Warlords leader, he is outclassed by Dofi, and unfortunately, as a Baroque Works leader, Baroque Works in general, as an archetype, is kind of weak, to be honest. Even if we were to look towards OP02, which I haven't talked about a whole lot, but even in that set, it doesn't really improve, as, a lot of the former Baroque Works characters have the typing X Baroque Works or something to that effect, making it a different typing entirely. And yes, while it can still, surprise some people, with the amount of improvement the other decks are seeing right now, this one really kind of lags behind. So that's why it's just a meh. Last but not least, it is Purple Kaido. So once again, this is another feel-good story from the deck limited battles. However, the difference between this and Crocodile is that this deck actually improves greatly with OP01. Set 1 gives Kaido access to even more Dawn ramp in the form of ulti, an improved King character card, and more versions of Kaido, including board wipe Kaido. More blockers for the meta, and even more targeted removal. Honestly, Kaido really balances this line between board control and aggression very well. And that is why I'm going to be not only calling this a meta deck, but I am going to be ranking this as the top of meta. Alright, so I did say that the Kaido one was last, but there is actually one more deck and one more tier I'd like to discuss. And that is Self-Destruct Kaido, who gets placed at the top of this tier list and earns the title God of Jank. This beautiful deck utilizes board wipe Kaido and synergizes with great on KO abilities from Caesar Clown, Miss Double Finger, Hold'em. So the whole entire idea of this thing is that you play these on KO abilities onto the field, and then when you want to, you just blow them up with board wipe Kaido. And these characters were chosen because their on KO abilities do synergize pretty well with getting blown up by your own character. So Miss Double Finger allows us to draw, Caesar Clown allows us to fetch Smiley from our deck onto the field. And with a deck like that that thrives on blowing up your own stuff, it was totally worthy, truly worthy of the God of Jank tier. But that is it for the tier list. Let me know down in the comments below what you think. Would love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about, the actual, meta decks, my rankings of them, and who is your God of Jank deck? Let me know in the comments. And once again, if you found this very helpful or useful, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel, as we'll be covering a lot more of OP01 Romance Dawn and the One Piece TCG. But if you want to see more One Piece TCG content now, check out this video where I break down the Luffy starter deck. Honestly, one of the contenders for the meta, going over the deck profile and what each card does. Thank you for watching, and captains, remember, build what you like, play what you love, and I'll catch you in the next video.